Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic Grammar Lessons. This is Lesson 17, in which we'll be talking about imperfect verbs. And this will actually be part 1, in which we're talking about forms. Now, more information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 140 to 163. And as you look at that information, you'll see that there are a number of other forms other than imperfects that makes sense to cover under the broader rubric of imperfect verbs. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to be talking about forms first and then come back to use in part 2. Let's get started. First, let's place the strong verb paradigm on the screen. Perhaps the first item that catches our eyes is the grayed out cell, second feminine singular, and then the other one, second feminine plural. Those are gray because these forms are not attested in the Bible, but they do appear outside the Bible in the Aramaic of that era. So these are reconstructed vocalizations, and they're included on this chart for completeness. Now, what might be a little less obvious from our first glance is, maybe we'll eventually notice, there are no passive stems on this chart. That's because passive stem imperfect verbs are not attested in Biblical Aramaic. And that could be helpful for us as we do our biblical interpretation. We shouldn't expect to see any passive stems for imperfect verbs. So once we determine that we're looking at an imperfect verb, we can concentrate, is this a GDC or those active voice stems, or is this TG, TD, the reflexive voice stems? So on one hand, this makes our parsing job easier. On the other hand, we just need to remember that that means that the reflexive stems are going to bear the load of representing passive voice in the absence of the passive voice stems. Okay, I'm going to use red now to do some highlighting on the Pa'al-G column. Now we remember that the perfect verbs were called the suffix conjugation, right? Because perfect verbs added suffixes to express person, gender, number. Well, the imperfect verb form is called the prefix conjugation because of the prefix system that we see here. And interestingly, these imperfect verb forms have the same prefix set as Hebrew imperfect verb forms. So the yod, the tav, the aleph, and then finally, for the first common plural, that nun, and interestingly, even the same vowels that we expect from our Hebrew intuition. Now, the suffixes, when they appear, are not the same, those there with the final nuns. So we'd have to pay attention to those, not from our intuition. Now, I'm shifting the use of red at this point to highlight the features of the derived stems, the stems other than G, that we will especially note to help us distinguish them as we're doing our biblical interpretation. We're going to march through those other stems in a moment. But first, let's concentrate again on the G column, specifically the third feminine singular and second masculine singular forms. What do we notice? They're the same, aren't they? Well, let's treat that subject for a moment. The Pa'al-G imperfect third feminine singular appears in Daniel 2:39, and then what is also indisputably parsed, the Pa'al-G imperfect second masculine singular appears in Daniel 5:16. And I'm using white highlighting here to show subject-verb agreement where I can explicitly show it in Daniel 2:39 there with the word kingdom, malku. So that's a feminine singular noun, and there's subject-verb agreement with the verb tishlat. So kingdom will rule. So that must be, according to context, the Pa'al-G imperfect third feminine singular. Well, we go down then to Daniel 5:16, and from context we know that this is referring to Daniel, so this you there is Daniel. So that's Pa'al-G imperfect second masculine singular. So just as with Biblical Hebrew, we're going to use our context. We're going to search for subject-verb agreement to try to figure out what's the correct parsing of that verb. Looking at the entire column now, this is the column to grow most familiar with, and then we contrast what we see in the derived stems with the Pa'al-G column. So moving over to the D stem, Pa'el. What's the most distinctive item that we see here? Well, of course, it's the doubled middle radical that we expect for the D stem. We do also notice that the imperfect prefix vowel here is shava, or in the case of aleph, the compound shava hatif patach. That having been said, going back to that doubled middle radical, that is important for distinguishing that this is the D stem. Moving on to the C stem, hafel, we see that the hey prefix stays. Now, the prefix vowel is actually the same with the pa-el. That's interesting, right? But the pa-el does not have the hey, and in the pa-el, to say once again, there's a doubled middle radical. That's not what hafel does. So unlike Hebrew, which would not keep the hifil H sound in there, right? It would not have the hey prefix of hifil. The hafel hey remains in the hafel C imperfect forms. Now, that having been said, we remember that there are other causative stems, right? The less commonly seen afel and shafel. So I want to just illustrate those. We notice that they all have the same prefix vowel, right? Under that yod. And I've been able to show imperfect third masculine singular for each of these causative stems. So the hafel imperfect third masculine singular and the afel imperfect third masculine singular, my examples are both the kof, vav, mem verbal root. For the hafel, we see that the hey is still there, it remains. But in afel, the aleph that would have been there as the prefix consonant for afel, that has gone away. That's what alephs are wont to do often in biblical Aramaic. And then finally, shafel, again, has that yod with the vocal shava, and then the form that we expect from shafel following. There aren't many shafel verbs, so we get accustomed to them quickly when we do see them. I just include these to show that whereas hafel shows up quite often, we need to remember that there are afels as well. Okay, TGTD, the reflexive stems. Well, in common, there's the tav infix, right? After the imperfect verb prefix, you have a tav infix. And yes, there are some vowel differences, but of course, the main distinguishing factor here is the TD has the double middle radical, and that's what we expect because it's TD. Okay, and TG lacks that doubled middle radical, as we can see. Of course, let's not forget the TC, hishtafel. So you see the yishta prefix there. The yod is the yod prefix, and I've lined it up with third masculine plural so you can see the shurek vav noon suffix. So yishta, that part is all the prefix that you get for the hishtafel imperfect, and then kaf lamed lamed. Now, moving to volitional forms. Volitional forms, just as in biblical Hebrew, are built off of the imperfect verb forms. So what I have done is I've labeled it imperfect in that column there. Of course, this is the Pa'al-G version, okay, of these combinations of person, gender, and number in the imperfect verb for simplicity and completeness. Now what I'm going to show is the volitional chart. What's missing? Well, we've said already that there's not going to be an attested cohortative in biblical Aramaic, and in fact, it hasn't been found in any form of Aramaic. So it's most likely Aramaic did not have a cohortative. So that's why first common singular, if you look across from that in the chart in the middle of the screen, and then first common plural, both of those cells are grayed. There's no first common singular, first common plural, any volitional form, and there's no column for cohortative at all. Okay, so that leaves us with jussive and imperative. Now, jussive is a volitional form that can be third person or second person, and imperative is only second person. So we're going to look at some examples of those. First, let's look at the third feminine singular, which, as we see in yellow, is the same form for the strong verb there, this strong verb paradigm between the imperfect and the jussive. But here's the thing. Unlike biblical Hebrew, we're not looking for certain weak verb types to have different forms between imperfect and jussive. We're going to cover what's different between those two forms in a moment, but these are the same. As you can see in Daniel 4:24, the example on the top, and then Ezra 6:8, the example on the bottom, identical forms, where you have, if there will be, that's, you see in red there, a lengthening of your prosperity, or let it be, given to the men. That's the jussive idea. Yes, that's a jussive, we know from context, but we don't have any morphological cue to know that in Ezra 6:8 we're looking at a jussive, whereas in Daniel 4:24 it's an imperfect third feminine singular. Okay, next up, let's look at the third masculine plural. Now we're going to see a difference here. Notice in the imperfect form there's a shurek vav nun suffix, and then I have the shurek vav suffix in red, but there's no nun. Okay, so the nun drops for third masculine plural. So this is interesting. In Biblical Aramaic, the distinctive nun of third masculine plural suffix there is not present. So unlike Biblical Aramaic, which depends on roots to have different forms between verbal roots, to have different forms between imperfect and jussive, it's actually the suffix on third masculine plural that helps us to know that this form in red in Jeremiah 10:11, may they perish. See that? From the earth and from under these heavens, that must be a jussive. And what's interesting is most modern Bible translations don't use this jussive rendering here, like may they or let them, those kind of ideas. They just assign a typical imperfect sort of future-like rendering. Whereas, of course, all of the grammatical references agree this must be a jussive, because otherwise there should be a nun there. And there's no text-critical evidence that there was ever a nun there. Okay. Let's look at now second-person jussive. So the second-person jussive that's attested in Biblical Aramaic is second masculine singular, which we see in Daniel 2:24. Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. The verbal root here is aleph, beit, dalet. The aleph has disappeared. The hafel, you see that there's that hey prefix, and then the tav in the front, which is just like in the imperfect second masculine singular, it's the prefix. So both the imperfect second masculine singular and the jussive second masculine singular have the same form, but what's different is if you have that al, that negation particle before it, we know we're looking at a jussive. This is the same as in biblical Hebrew. Now look below. I could not get an example from the Bible of a hafel c imperfect second masculine singular, but what I did get is this use of a different negative particle before an imperfect. So I'm putting the negative particles in white. See this? So that's the la negative particle. That's the negative particle that imperfect verb forms use. The negative particle that jussives use is al, as we see on the top in Daniel 2:24. So going to the bottom so that Daniel and his companions would not be destroyed. Literally, they would not destroy. I say literally because this looks like one of the situations where there's this unstated, who is this? They, right? That it's expressing a passive voice-like idea. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that use of la before an imperfect and the al before the jussive. Now, let's shift from third and second person jussive to talking about the imperative. Imperatives are only second person, and they all have forms that are different from the imperfect. And how are they different? Well, the tav prefix is cut off. And then for second feminine singular and second masculine plural, there's actually a difference beyond that, and that's the final nun has dropped. So this is similar to what's happened in the jussive of third masculine plural. So look at this. Here's the pa'alg imperative masculine plural. Therefore, tell me the dream. If it were imperfect second masculine plural, there would be a nun at the end, as well as, of course, the tav prefix. And so here you can see those for the pa'alg imperfect second masculine plural of the aleph mem resh root. Thus you shall say to them. So we see the tav prefix, we see shurek vav nun suffix instead of shurek vav alone in the imperative. So what have we learned from this so far? We've learned that the attested forms in biblical Aramaic of jussives and imperatives drop final nuns that would be necessary from imperfect verb forms. And the last subject are special imperfect forms of the hey vav hey verb. So I'm going to build this to show why the he, vav, he verb has special imperfect forms. So I'm going to borrow the third masculine singular, third masculine plural, third feminine plural forms from that strong verb pa'al column. So that's a pattern we're going to work off of, just the strong verb pattern. He, vav, he is certainly not a strong verb by any means, but we're going to work off this pattern. And I'm providing some strong verb examples. So for third masculine singular, third masculine plural, I was able to get a samek gimel dalet, same verbal root. He will pay homage, they will pay homage. And you see the form as expected. And then shin, kaf, noon for the third feminine plural. They, of course that's the feminine they, will dwell. Now look at this for he, vav, he. What do you see that's different? Well, I'm going to use red to show what's different. Lamed prefixes. What in the world? Okay, we may not have expected that at all. So let's discuss why there are lamed prefixes for these combinations of person, gender, and number for he, vav, he, that verb alone. So let's look at the third masculine singular form. Expand it. And now consider if I wipe off the vowels and I restore the yod we would have expected for the third masculine singular form, what do we see? We see the divine name, don't we? Yod he vav he. Now what it looks like has happened here is it looks like there's a concerted effort not to write yod he vav, which is, you would get that for the third masculine plural and the third feminine plural form also. This is a distinguishing feature of Jewish Aramaic. Other nations, other peoples' use of Aramaic, they did not substitute in a lamed, they just used the yod. And in fact, there are some Qumran scrolls, non-biblical, that slip up, I guess, and have a yod instead of a lamed. But it's actually characteristic of Jewish Aramaic to have a lamed there. Now, the hypothesis that it's not written down anywhere why this is done, but the belief that this is to avoid writing the divine name is underscored by a couple factors. One is that the tav prefixed imperfect verb forms of he, vav, he, they maintain their tav because there's no danger of the divine name appearing with a tav prefix. Okay? And then another factor is that yod he, vav, he never appears in the corpus of biblical Aramaic. Now, this might make sense from a literary standpoint in that we're emphasizing Gentile contexts and so forth, but this looks like a very concerted strategy, referring to the God of heaven and so forth, to avoid using the divine name in biblical Aramaic. And here is just a special feature to remember about the he, vav, he verb. For these combinations of person, gender, and number, there's going to be a lamed prefix instead of yod. And that brings us to the end of our discussion of morphology about forms. In the next part, we're going to be talking about the use of imperfect verbs, just as we did for perfect verbs. And I look forward to studying these uses with you.